No president in history has ever wanted to be investigated. No person in history has ever wanted that. But presidents, and I would include Nixon, and I would certainly include Reagan, Bush, and I would include Clinton, all the way up through now, have understood that there does need at times to be some sort of DOJ investigation. It needs to be carried out with some level of independence. Now, various presidents have taken various steps to undermine that, but they've never gotten to the point where Trump is right now of there will be no investigation of me. Anyone who thinks about it will be fired and maybe prosecuted yourself. But the second thing is what Democrats did during the 4 years between Trump's presidencies do not excuse or justify what Trump's doing now. But Democrats don't have clean hands here. There's hypocrisy on the Democratic side also. For all the talk of rule of law and all men are created equal and treated equal under the law, I don't think you can support that in an objective sense when you look back at all of the cases that were brought against Trump.
Welcome to Open Book. I am your host, Anthony Scaramucci. Joining us now is best-selling author, CNN legal analyst, and dear friend, Ellie Honig. You know, Ellie, when you're a lawyer and you pass the bar, you have to take continuing education credits.
Yeah.
I feel like your books are continuing education for me. I mean, I'm learning more from your books than I did in law school.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. Say.
I'm so glad to hear you say that. And by the way, I'm going to make a petition to the New Jersey and Pennsylvania bars where I'm admitted that I should get credit. Like I shouldn't have to sit through some webinar. I wrote this book. That should count.
I'm with you. There's a lot of content in here. Okay, so the title of your new book, and you wrote two great books prior to this one, but the title of the new book is When You Come at the King, Inside DOJ's Pursuit of the President from Nixon to Trump. And so obviously we know the other part of that cliche, when you come at the king,
you best not miss.
You better not miss.
Yeah, exactly.
And so you got some great stories in here. So it's always great to have you back on Open Book. You called the special counsels the ultimate test of American justice. Why did you write that? And why did you write this story right now when accountability for presidents, particularly President Trump, it feels more fragile than ever?
So I think there's two reasons, Anthony. First of all, these cases are the most important cases that we've seen in this country over the last half century. I mean, there's a chapter basically for each of the main cases from Watergate to Iran-Contra to Clinton and Ken Starr, all the way up through the Mueller, Hur, Durham, Jack Smith cases. And, we have just come through a period where we've had a glut of these. There was a point where we had 5 of them basically in about a half decade, which was historically unusual. And I thought, well, I think we need to get inside these cases, which I do in this book. I talked to 36 people who were actually involved in the cases, prosecutors, defense lawyers, witnesses, White House officials. And what lesson can we draw from it? And then the second thing, to your point, Anthony, it couldn't have come out at a better time. What we see Donald Trump doing now, day by day basis, even just this past few days when Trump is ordering Pam Bondi, that I want you to indict Letitia James, I don't care really what the evidence is making the point, and this goes to the title of the book, that what the Trump administration is doing now is pure payback. It's retribution. It's when you come at the king, you best not miss. And I don't mean to, and I don't celebrate that. I use this descriptively. In fact, in the book, I argue this is incredibly dangerous. This is a complete misuse of DOJ's prosecutorial power. And really what's happened now is Trump has kicked down the wall of independence that used to define DOJ to keep it what it was.
I feel like, I want to test something on you. I was reading your book and I said, I feel like if Trump had won re-election, we wouldn't be in the trouble that we're in. Hear me out for a second.
In 2020, you mean?
Yeah, he had a lot of Republicans still on the playing field with him. I mean, traditional Republicans. He was still adhering to some basic ideas about the presidency. You wouldn't have had the big insurrection, the January 6th disaster,
right,
which is now in the public lore. We'll call it the insurrection, but it also called into question and made many Americans question their own election integrity, which is exactly what our adversaries would like us to do in the country. I feel like if he just won, he would have served his 4 years very sloppily, lots of Twitter explosions and craziness, and it would have been over.
It's an interesting
now we have this sort of 10-year yoke over us. Am I wrong in thinking
it's
that?
An interesting counterfactual because for two reasons. One, if you compare Trump 2, which we're in now, to Trump 1, there's big differences. I mean, Trump 1, he did a lot of the things that you just talked about, Anthony. And my first book was about Bill Barr, his primary attorney general during those years, his second AG during those years. And, while Trump would have these temper tantrums and say, I want to see, John Kerry indicted. I want to see Barack Obama indicted. Hillary Clinton, Andy McCabe. Maybe you, Anthony. I don't know if he maybe fired one of those at
Well,
you. Wouldn't shock
he
me.
hasn't come for me yet. I'm too much of a piker, but
Right, right,
I think if he wins the midterms, he's going to put some people in jail for sure.
right. So
I think that's the next move.
and that's the
jail
thing.
time for some of these people.
This was talk during the first term, but nobody did it. Bill Barr basically just ignored him, as did others, and nobody was indicted. But now Trump seems like he's serious, and he seems like in Pam Bondi, he has a person who's willing to do it. I think the second part of considering your counterfactual, what if Trump had won in 2020? I mean, yeah, I don't think all these criminal cases, they certainly would not have landed while he was president in this scenario from 2020 up through January of 2025. There wouldn't have been a January 6th. Who knows, with the classified documents, he wouldn't have been a private citizen. So, and I do argue in the book, I want to make clear, like, the book is not some sort of anti-Trump screed. I'm critical of Trump and the way he's done this, but I'm also not afraid to be critical in the book of some of the things that were done to get Donald Trump. The Jack Smith chapter has some criticisms of Merrick Garland and Jack Smith. I don't argue that they were acting, in the same way that Trump is, but their hands are not clean either. There were things that they did that were inappropriate, that were clearly designed to go after Trump in a way you would not have gone after a normal person.
So that brings the hypocrisy question. Again, these are questions I've been dying to ask you since I closed the book. So we rail on free speech, unless you're saying something that we like, Democrats and Republicans. Great op-ed today in the New York Times about that. Additionally, we don't want you to pick winners. I mean, we don't want you to tell you who's going to be the TikTok investors, but yet Democrats make an investment in Solyndra. It goes to zero. And there's whataboutisms now on both sides where, they go after each other in a way that I don't think they previously went after each other. Maybe I'm wrong. You point out Nixon, you give up other situations, the Iran-Contra, things like that. Right. But it just seemed like it was tamer, Ellie, or was I just younger and more naive?
No,
or you tell me.
It was different. I mean, it used to be that, and again, I talked to Watergate prosecutors, Iran-Contra prosecutors, both sides of the Clinton Starr case. It used to be, look, no president in history has ever wanted to be investigated, right? No person in history has ever wanted that. But presidents, and I would include Nixon, and I would certainly include Reagan, Bush, and I would include Clinton, all the way up through now, have understood that there does need at times to be some sort of DOJ investigation. It needs to be carried out with some level of independence. Now, various presidents have taken various steps to undermine that, but they've never gotten to the point where Trump is right now of, there will be no investigation of me. Anyone who thinks about it will be fired and maybe prosecuted yourself. But the second thing is, and I think what Democrats did during the 4 years between Trump's presidencies do not excuse or justify what Trump's doing now. But Democrats don't have clean hands here. There's hypocrisy on the Democratic side also. For all the talk of rule of law and all men are created equal and treated equal under the law, I don't think you can support that in an objective sense when you look back at all of the cases that were brought against Trump. I mean, before we get into the criminal stuff, the Letitia James case, look, I don't think Letitia James should be indicted now. I don't think there's a case there. Todd Blanche doesn't think there's a case there. But her lawsuit against Trump was ridiculous. And I said this many times, Anthony, publicly, I'm sure probably with you. She ran for office on Vote for Me and I'll nail Trump. She goes, I don't know what, something, I'll sue him, I'll indict him for money laundering. She brings this ridiculous lawsuit. And just the other day, a liberal appeals court in New York throws out the whole financial penalty for exactly the reasons I was saying. There was no real victim. So now he's still liable, but the financial penalty has been zeroed out now. That's quite a rebuke. I think the Alvin Bragg hush money case was ridiculous. It certainly backfired politically. I think that'll get thrown out. And I think if you look at, I'm not even going to talk about Fonnie Willis. That case was a joke and sidetracked itself. And then even if you look at Jack Smith, there are things that he did that you would never have done to anyone else. I'll give you one example. Jack Smith indicts Trump on January 6th, as he should have, in my view. But then Smith says, now Smith's up against this mad dash against the clock because he wants to try Trump before the 2024 election. But the problem is DOJ wasted so much time. It took him 2.5 years to indict this guy. So Jack Smith says, I want to try him 5 months from the indictment. 5 months from the indictment, Anthony. This is a case with $13 million pages of discovery. There is no physical way Donald Trump could exercise his right to effective defense counsel. They could not have gone through 13 million pages in 5 months. The average case, I looked this up in DC, your average gun drug case gets 2 years and 4 months, 28 months to prep for trial. And Jack Smith made a straight face argument. He needs to go to trial within 5 months. The reason was the election, of course, but he wouldn't say it. And so there was some disingenuousness and hypocrisy from Democrats as well. Now, that doesn't justify Trump firing back 10 times greater as he's doing now, but Dems can't claim clean hands here either.
So was Archibald Cox, was he at Harvard Law School when you were there, or he had already left?
Are you kidding? Archibald Cox was like taught in the 70s. I was born in 75.
Okay. No, Archibald Cox was there when I was
maybe
there.
he went back. I guess he went back. You're right.
Yeah, he went back.
Actually,
back.
I take back my little laugh there. He might have been there in 2000 when I was there. I don't know. Yeah, you're right.
All right, well, anyway, he was there when I was there. He gave a big speech about the Saturday Night Massacre. So for the young listeners that don't know who even Archibald Cox is, tell us who Archibald Cox is. You wrote great stories about him and what is known as the Saturday Night Massacre. Tell us what that is.
There's so much great color. So Archibald Cox gets brought in under political, Nixon's under political fire. He agrees to bring in Cox as the as the special prosecutor for Watergate. And I talked to two people who were on Cox's team. They were 30 and 26 at the time. Now they're in their 70s and 80s. Jill Wine-Banks and Jim Quarles. Cox was this venerated Harvard Law professor. Quarles had been his student. And the investigation was starting to make real inroads towards Nixon. And then on this Saturday night in October of 1973, he orders his AG, Elliot Richardson, to fire Cox. Richardson refuses. The deputy AG refuses. William Ruckelshaus, they both resign. So you lose your top two officials. And then Cox gets fired anyway. So those three all get decapitated. Jill Wine-Banks tells me a great story that I have in the book about how she experienced the Saturday Night Massacre. She was at a wedding. She said she couldn't get a day off for weeks and months at a time. Finally, that Saturday, she got to go to New York City for a family wedding. She comes back at midnight. This is before the era of phones. The desk clerk jumps out and hands her a message that says, "The office has been seized. Return immediately." So next morning, she goes down. It's a Sunday morning now. She's there. Quarles is there. The other prosecutors are there. And they don't know what's going on. They don't know. They know Archibald Cox has been fired, but they don't know if, are we fired? Is this continuing? And they're all sort of sitting there. The office has actually been roped off with police tape. And Cox comes in. I guess they let him back in. They never let him back in now. But at the time, they let him back in, I guess, to clear out his desk or something. And he comes into the prosecutors and he tells them, don't give him what he wants, meaning Nixon. You stay here and you finish the job. Robert Bork comes in. Robert Bork gets blamed a lot of times. I think it's unfair. I think actually Robert Bork was a hero in this because he stopped the bleeding and he made sure Leon Jaworski got appointed. A lot of the historians I spoke to actually agree with me. Jaworski becomes a special counsel and then ultimately leads to the subpoena, the Supreme Court case, and Nixon resigns. So, the Saturday Night Massacre, it's sort of miraculous, but because of the integrity and the courage of these prosecutors, the case carried on and led to Nixon's resignation. I'll tell you real quick, Anthony, a funny story that they told me that's in the book. There was a restaurant, which apparently is still there in D.C., across the street from their offices, which were near DuPont Circle, called Archibald's. And one day, Archie Cox, again, this very starched, patrician guy, says, "We should go to lunch there. That place is named after me. It's called Archibald's. That's my name." And they're like, "Yeah, Archie, that's a strip club. I don't think we should go there." So
he should have gone there. It would have probably loosened them up a little bit. He was pretty uptight. When I was there. The interesting thing about Bork, this predated you a little, but when I was in school, constitutional law scholar Professor Lawrence Tribe was battling to block Robert Bork from getting on the court.
Yeah,
he was nominated by Ronald Reagan, and they successfully blocked him. From getting on the court.
Well, and part of what was used against him, part of it was his ideology was deemed too extreme, but his involvement in Watergate. And I'll tell you something about the book. So we commonly look at Bork as the villain of the Saturday Night Massacre, right? The guy who came in and carried out Nixon's order. But if you do the research, both the AG, Elliot Richardson, and the deputy AG, both guys who resigned later, years later, said, "Oh, no, we asked Bork to do that. We begged him to stay because we knew the bloodletting had to stop at some point." There was actually no chain of command within DOJ after Bork. Bork had nothing to do with Watergate until this. And Bork felt misled later. And I asked Garrett Graff, who's a great Watergate historian, and he said, "No, I agree with you. I think Bork is misremembered. I think he was a hero." And I will tell you, since the book came out, I got a note from Robert Bork's son who said basically, I thank you. Like, I feel like our father has not been remembered correctly through history. So, Bork was like this gruff guy with the goatee and everything, and he had very sharp conservative views. But when it comes to Watergate, he's miscast as the villain.
But it's the early stages of villainization in our society, right?
Yeah.
Because that's what we do to each other. We two-dimensionalize people, Ellie, and we go hard. And so the left-wing media went hard at him. The right-wing media goes hard at George Soros.
Yeah.
Listen, I've been on Wall Street for 37 years, Ellie. George Soros was always looked up to on Wall Street.
Yeah.
You know who worked for George Soros? Scott Bessent, Stephen Mnuchin, Stanley Druckenmiller.
So interesting, yeah.
Yeah, they all went to work
it just
for him.
becomes a buzzword. They just say the word Soros. And,
because he went against Cheney during the Iraqi war. And so the conservatives said, we're going to do to George Soros what the hard left did to Robert Bork.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and look, there's a verb
they
now.
Villainize and demonize.
If you look at the Urban Dictionary, to get borked is actually a word now. It means basically to get demonized in that way. Yeah.
All right. Well, if I'm going to get borked, I'm going to wear protection, Ellie. Okay. I just want to let you know that. Okay. Let's go to what Robert Ray said to you. Everyone loves the idea of an outside prosecutor until one gets appointed at them.
Right.
So what a true line, right? I mean, so evidential in your book.
Yeah. So look,
because these guys are like, we're going to have a special prosecutor. And then when it starts picking and probing at them, they flip out.
I mean, Bill Clinton signed the final reauthorization of the independent counsel law in 94. George H.W. Bush, I have in the book, actually told the guy he had just beaten 2 years before, actually said to him, I would not recommend signing that. Like, this law is a problem. And Clinton, I don't know if he wanted to or not, but he obviously felt like he had no choice. And what ends up happening, he becomes the receiving end of the whole Ken Starr thing. But I certainly do not argue in this book that special counsels or independent counsels are perfect. They're highly, vastly imperfect. A lot of this book is exposing that. But I also think we do need some sort of mechanism in place so we don't end up with no check on the president like we have now. Bob Ray is an interesting figure because he ends up replacing Ken Starr. Ken Starr starts off with Whitewater, which is just these real estate deals in Arkansas. He's not getting anywhere. He gets some people around the Clintons, but not the Clintons themselves. And I talked to David Kendall in the book, who represented Bill Clinton, and Lanny Brewer, who was a White House lawyer at the time. And they both said he was just hanging on, waiting for something. And then Monica Lewinsky emerges like manna from heaven for him. I actually also talked to a guy named Saul Weisenberg, who was Ken Starr's number 2. Starr died a few years ago. And Saul was very candid. He said, I was on a detail that was supposed to run out in February of 98. And I felt like we were playing out the string. But the Monica stuff hit in January of 98. And I thought, now I'm going to stick around. This is getting good. So, of course, it all spins vastly out of control, becomes an impeachment, becomes ridiculous. They're horrible. Both sides are horrible in their treatment of Monica Lewinsky. And it ends up basically killing the independent counsel law because both sides hated it. I mean, Clinton survives the impeachment. He leaves with a record high approval rating. Democrats hate it. Republicans hate it. And it lapses. But anyway, Bob Ray takes over the case at the very end, the last year or so. And he was in an interesting position because by this point, everyone was done with this case. The impeachment was over. And Bob said to me, but we still had a problem. We had to decide if we're going to prosecute Bill Clinton for perjury. And I said, you're kidding me. There's no way you would have indicted him. Bob goes 95% of the way in the book to saying that he would have if he had to. He said to me, all the pieces were in place. But Bill, he ends up having this, and I detail this in the book, a dramatic not one-on-one, but face-to-face meeting with Clinton in the map room of the White House, like 20 days before Clinton leaves office, and says, we need you to admit that you were untruthful. We need you to pay a fine, and we need you to lose your bar license. And basically, Clinton agrees to that on his last day in office. But Bob Ray basically makes clear to me that if Clinton had not agreed to that, he would have indicted. And I said, Bob, you would have lost. You would have lost in 2 seconds. And he goes, maybe, but I felt like I was going to do what I have to do. But Bob understands that the idea of a special counsel is lovely in theory until you're on the receiving end of one.
So let me ask you this, because I've another big question for me. The presidential immunity case. Would Nixon, under that ruling, have gotten in trouble?
Ooh, see, I love that question because what I argue in the book is the ruling is very broad and vague, and it no question will make it harder for people in the future to prosecute presidents. but there still is conduct that can be prosecuted. And I think my argument would be what Nixon did there would be prosecutable, because he was in on, to some extent, the break-in. He knew of it, or he knew of it shortly thereafter. He was in on the cover-up, but that's political. If your political arm is committing crimes or whatever, that's pretty clearly, even that is outside the scope of the immunity ruling. It would be a little oddly, it would probably be worse conduct, but actually more within the immunity ruling if he was using his own cabinet members or federal executive branch officials to commit these crimes. But the fact that he was doing it with private citizens engaged in political activity, so that's a great example. Like, some people say no president could ever be prosecuted again. I don't think that's true. I think if you really look at the immunity opinion, there is plenty of conduct that can still be prosecuted. I do argue in the book that the immunity decision went way too far, but I also argue that doesn't mean everyone should just give up on accountability for all time.
I've heard, and I want you to react to this. I've heard that the Supreme Court's afraid of Trump. I've heard that Roberts is worried that he's going to render a decision against Trump, and Trump is going to flip him the bird, and he's going to get no support from the Congress or other elements of the government. Do you think that that's bogus?
I don't buy that. I don't think the Supreme Court is like loves Trump. You'll hear something, oh, these guys. I mean, maybe Alito and Thomas, but no. I mean, there's very little Trump can do to them. The only thing he could really do is defy one of their orders and sort of bring us into this crisis moment. But he's had chances to do that, and while he has defied the spirit of some of the orders, including those early immigration orders, he hasn't quite stepped over the line of overtly defying an explicit order from the Supreme Court. So I don't think they're afraid of him. I think I can understand they're concerned he might do that, but I don't think they're pulling punches or doing him favors because of that.
All right, I just want to throw that out.
Look,
there.
They rule against him a lot. They rule against. There's this notion out there of, they're always they've ruled against Trump quite a bit.
Give me one example where they ruled against him.
Several of the immigration cases where they said you have to give people due process that he wasn't giving. Some of the firing cases and the withholding of federal funding cases, they've said you can't do that. They ruled against him on his tax returns when he got subpoenaed for his tax returns. They refused to block Jack Smith from releasing his special counsel report. Like, there's a lot. I mean, he's done well with the Supreme Court, but it's not like he's gone undefeated with them or they've always sided with him. By the way, I should say, I know you're financially focused. I believe they're going to strike down the tariffs too. That's coming up in November.
So you're reading my mind because I'm dying to ask you that question. So
this is not investment advice. Let me make clear. Right. So I don't, but I think that case, we know the Supreme Court is expediting and hearing it in November. I think they'll probably rule by the new year, right around then. And Trump has lost the first two rounds of this in the district court and the Court of Appeals. And I think what Trump has done in passing these tariffs actually violates conservative principles, because Congress holds tariff power, not the president. If Congress is going to delegate a power like that, they can, but they have to do it clearly and unambiguously in a statute. And this statute that Trump has used, the IEPA, the Emergency Economic Powers Act, International Economic Emergency Powers Act, A, arguably doesn't cover tariffs at all, and B, isn't specific enough. So I think if you use traditionally conservative legal principles, he loses. I mean, definitely the three liberals will be against him because they always are, almost no matter what. And I think he's going to lose at least two of the conservatives. If I had to guess, don't invest based on this, folks. I know a lot of you wealthy Wall Street people will listen to Anthony, but if I had to guess, I would guess it's going to get struck down.
Okay, but there's big consequences to that. That means there's $1 trillion or so of tax revenue, because that's all tariffs are. I mean, the president is telling the biggest lie of lies. He says all the countries are paying the tariffs.
No, it's the importers.
The consumer is paying the tariffs.
Well, the importers pay it and pass it to the consumer. Yeah,
of course. Yeah, of course. It's a consumption tax. Yeah. We both know this. Yeah. So what happens? They have to return the money to the people that they
So I think the answer is that the importers can actually try to recover the money they've paid. Yes. There is some case law.
But on a going forward basis, the tariff nonsense, him coming down from evil Mount Evil with the like Orange Moses
Right, I
with
know
the
the
tablet.
tablets.
All of that stuff's going away then.
Yeah, I mean, there are some tariffs that are separate from the ones he announced on Liberation Day back in April. There are some on certain types of raw materials and things that could stay in place because he's done them under different legal guidance, legal authority. But those whole Liberation Day tariffs, if the Supreme Court strikes them down, they're all dead. So, I'm sure the financial industry and markets will be watching that case more than probably any case in a long time.
The market's not set up for that, just so you know. The market expects the Supreme Court to rule with them.
Oh, is that right?
So, yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's how the market's acting. I mean, that's my prediction.
Okay.
I hope you're right. I think it's been insanely stupid to do this.
Yeah.
So, are you more optimistic or more pessimistic and cynical about America and holding the powerful to account after writing this book?
I think I'm more optimistic than the average person, right? I mean, I think a lot of people have sort of gone to the point of no one's ever going to be held accountable. But I think if it's done in a measured and fair way, I propose a policy at the end of this, a way we can sort of change the way we structure these special counsel cases to yield better results and more permanency. But I think we can still hold people to account. I think Trump has defied the rules in a lot of ways, has defied the normal laws of gravity. I also think some of the Democratic missteps and oversteps, this is really the subject of my second book, undermine the effort to bring him to justice. The second book I wrote in 2022, while all these Trump cases were about to get started, I said he's in the book, basically, he's going to get indicted probably more than once. And everyone's telling you he's going to go to jail and the walls are closing in, but it's not going to be as easy as you think. And here's why. And that ended up all being true. But I still do think we can, it's not going to happen. Look, let's be real. It's not like this administration over the next 3 years is going to have some sudden epiphany and go, oh yeah, we need to allow for better accountability. But this book is largely a pitch to whoever comes next, be it a Republican or Democrat, J.D. Vance or, Kamala Harris or Gavin Newsom or whoever, that this can work. We can have, and we do have a history, not a perfect history, but a history of meaningful accountability through this idea of special counsel or outside prosecutors. There's things we need to do to change it, but I'm not ready to give up on accountability for all time.
All right. So you've done this podcast before. I've got 5 words I want to present to you, and I want you to react to them. Okay, you ready?
Yes.
I say the word Nixon. You say what?
I can respond in more than one word.
Yeah, of course.
Got meaningful accountability imposed on him because of brave prosecutors.
Clinton.
Abused his power, mistreated Monica Lewinsky, but ultimately was over-pursued by Ken Starr.
Okay. Joe Biden.
Biden was fairly exemplary when it came to his respect for the independent Justice Department until he pardoned his own son and blamed politics in a Trumpian statement. I think that pardon undermined Joe Biden's legacy. After telling us for months he would do no such thing because he respected the justice system. Yeah.
And that was probably not an auto pen pardon. Let's put it that way. All right. How about Trump?
Has gotten away with almost everything and will redefine the way that we look at the justice system and accountability from here on.
Yeah, and Democrats, trust me, there will be ambitious Democrats that take advantage of and study Trump's playbook. Yeah. So, all right, let's go to the last 2 words, special counsel. You say what?
Imperfect, but better than any other system and can be improved.
Yeah, I learned that from you, actually. I didn't really understand the mechanisms of it, but you have to do that. I guess I'm wondering if the whole Justice Department at this point should be a special counsel, meaning
well, look,
should it get moved out of the executive branch? I don't know where you put it. I'm not saying you could put it in the judicial branch, but you got to get it away from the powers that be, particularly if they have to examine at times the powers that be.
And that's sort of my proposal with respect to special counsel, that it needs to be more insulated, but you also can't be politically unaccountable. We can't have prosecutors doing whatever they want with no consequence. But there are models for that. And I will tell you, I pulled it from not only scholarly articles, but from these people. Like I asked the lawyers, the players, what rules do you think worked and didn't work, and what would you like to see happen? But I agree with you. I would like to see some sort of, you can't pull it out of the executive branch entirely, but I would like to see it more independent, more insulated.
Well, listen, the book is awesome. When you come at the king, inside DOJ's pursuit of the president, from Nixon to Trump. I'm sorry I don't have the book in front of me. I would also hold it. Hold it up, Ellie. Hold it up. Hold the book up. I was looking for the book this morning, but I have it at home.
There you go.
And love the book. It's from
you.
Ellie Honig. Thank you so much for joining us once again on Open Book.
Great to see you, Anthony. Thanks.
Now is a dear friend, Jared Cohen. He's joining us on Open Book. He's a New York Times best-selling author. He's president of Global Affairs and co-head of Applied Innovation at Goldman Sachs. He's a former CEO of Jigsaw. And you've written a lot of different books, by the way. You are a polymath. I'm sure your mother's very proud of you, Jared, okay, as she should be. But this book is fascinating, and I think it's well-timed. Life After Power, 7 Presidents and Their Search for Purpose Beyond the White House. I'm a huge fan of your books. I want to talk about a couple of them, if you don't mind. But before we do that, let's start with an open-ended question. What happens after stepping down from being leader of the free world?
Look, it's the most dramatic retirement in the world, right? You're literally the most powerful person in the world, and you're either fired by, millions of people and you go back to being a civilian, or you get termed out and you go back to being a civilian anyway. And you look at these presidents, they're these seemingly unrelatable people, right? They're only dealing with matters of, world hunger and world peace and these kind of big macro level issues. And then they wake up the next day and they all of a sudden have asymmetry of information. They watch their successors, whether they like them or not, slowly dismantle their legacy. They're left with the relationships that are often kind of broken and fragile and need to be repaired. Their whole pace of life changes. There's nothing quite like it. And all of a sudden, these presidents become figures that, much to my surprise, you can start to relate to, right? I mean, we all ask this question many times in our lives of what's next. And, it's not just about the last chapter of life. We're going to ask it several times throughout the course of our time on this earth. And we don't think to look at presidents of the United States, but the more dramatic the transition, the harder the transition is. And the harder the transition is, I think, the more prescriptive it is. And so, my last book looked at happens when presidents die in office. This one looks at what happens when they live. And I look at 7 different presidents. Each got after it in a very different way, and each represents a different model for how to answer the question, what's next?
Okay, so it's a good segue, because we're dying to know on Open Book why you chose those 7. What was the criteria that went off in your mind? Obviously, list the 7 for our viewers, if you don't mind. And then did you consider including any others?
So it's an interesting question. Which presidents do you include, right? And I was looking for presidents that I felt found a greater sense of purpose after they left the White House. And what I was surprised by is the story of post-presidencies is not a particularly happy one. They range from presidents developing alcohol addictions to suffering from severe depression, many meandering and not knowing what to do. Alexander Hamilton, by the way, famously asked the question in Federalist 72, is it a good idea for the stability of the republic and the well-being of our country to have half a dozen men who served as president wandering around the rest of us like disenchanted ghosts? And frankly, many of the ex-presidents wandered around like disenchanted ghosts. The 7 that I chose were frankly the only 7 that I thought were really worth covering, all for different reasons. And so I look at Thomas Jefferson, who was a lifelong founder, 3 things etched on his tombstone, none of which was being president. His last act was the founding of University of Virginia. It was the 3rd volume in his life trilogy. The other is obviously the Declaration of Independence and Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom. I look at John Quincy Adams, who is a man whose presidency was an intermission between 2 of the greatest acts in history, one architected for him by his parents that made him president, the other that he sort of stumbled in as an ex-president serving 9 terms in the House of Representatives, where in a much lower station, he found a much higher calling of abolition. I look at Grover Cleveland, who's the man who made a comeback. He's the only president in history who's successfully run for office again and won. I look at William Howard Taft, who represents, a story that I think is familiar to many people, which is you have some dream, something that you want to do, and you have to defer it because the timing isn't right, the circumstances aren't right. And all he ever wanted to be was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. But his wife, his mentor, Theodore Roosevelt, and his brothers wanted him to be president. And it's only in his last 10 years of life that he becomes Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. I look at Herbert Hoover, who represents a story of recovery. The man lived 90 years. He's defined by 3.5, of the Great Depression while he was president. He was known as the great humanitarian and a great businessman, self-made millionaire before the presidency. And he spent his 32 years in the post-presidency not just trying to recapture his good name, but more importantly, recapturing his ability to serve the world as a great humanitarian and leader. I look at Jimmy Carter, who wanted to turn the presidency into a lifelong appointment. And he was the first one to take the idea of being a former version of yourself and build real infrastructure around it and use it as a platform. And his 42 plus years as a post-president is the longest in history. And then when I looked at the active living presidents, right, because Carter's obviously gone into hospice since last February. So when I look at the active living presidents, there's only one whose popularity has doubled. So George W. Bush's popularity is north of 60%, and yet he's done less to invest in his legacy than anyone else. And so I wanted to understand why. And it's a combination of his just dogmatic, disciplined reverence for Washington's principle of one president at a time. The fact that that's aged well in the era of Trump when you sort of juxtapose the two against each other, and the fact that he's managed to find a post-presidential voice that allows him to advocate for issues that he cares about through painting in ways that doesn't undermine his successors. And he's had a popularity renaissance. And whether you like him or not, it's hard to argue with that. And you compare that with, other active living presidents who dogmatically and obsessively focus on trying to build their legacy, they would die for George W. Bush's numbers.
Well, I mean, there's so much there, and that's why I'm letting you talk, because you're brilliant and you're erudite, and I learned so much from you. Accidental presidents, I learned so much because that's a weird circumstance as well. You're sitting there as the vice president one moment, and John Gardner, I think it wasn't worth more than a bucket of, and we cleansed it up and called it spit. And then boom, you're the leader of the free world. And those stories were very intriguing. This is different. Reagan said in his book, The American Life, he said that, wow, I got endless number of phone calls and messages. The day I left Washington, I was down to, I think the dry cleaner said I had to go pick up something in Santa Barbara. Bush, in the last couple of pages of his book, he writes about taking his dog out for a walk. And of course, you have to curb your dog in the residential area he's living in Houston. And so he's down on his knees with a plastic baggie on his hand, cleaning the dog poo from his dog. And he's just letting people know that he went from being the American president, leader of the free world, and now he's on his knees taking care of his leader, which happens to be his dog. And so you know the story there. I guess what I would say to you that is always fascinating to me about these people is, how do they see themselves? I know how you see them. I know how I see them. But when you do the homework on these people, how do they see themselves, Jared?
So, Anthony, this is one of my favorite parts about writing presidential history, is you get to try to really get in the head of these, great leaders who've been deceased for a long period of time. It's almost like, what you hear about actors doing, right? So Daniel Day-Lewis, before he plays Lincoln, he, spends multiple years like getting in the brain of Abraham Lincoln. And that's one of, I find, the most interesting, and it can also be kind of a torturing experience writing these books. But look, I think it varies. These are 7 very different men that I wrote about. And, to sort of begin where we left off, George W. Bush is unique to any other president in the sense that he has this ability to live life as a chapter guy, right? So when one chapter is done, he just completely detaches and moves on. He's not at all introspective. He feels like you can't long for what you can't have. He tells me when it's over, and he doesn't miss it. And frankly, I believe him. That bothers people who are critical of him, but that's who he is. But then you look at somebody like Thomas Jefferson, and Thomas Jefferson, this is a man who just personality-wise, he was what we would today describe as a serial entrepreneur or a serial founder. And at a very, very young age, he was a co-founder of the United States. And he was well aware that he had built a sort of republic business that, had many, many flaws that they couldn't get around to patching up or weren't right to patch up. And he had deep, deep anxiety as one of the last living founding fathers that if they didn't train the next generation to improve the product wouldn't last. And so after writing the Declaration of Independence and the Virginia Statute on Religious Freedom, he wanted to finish the third volume of his life trilogy and found the university, the first arts and sciences university in the country to do this, which became known as the University of Virginia. The problem is, like any founder, he got saddled with obligations, right? They needed him to be vice president. They needed him to be secretary of state. They needed him to be president twice. And he lost very valuable years. Those were not things that he wanted to do. He wanted to get on to found the next thing. And the poor guy at 82 years old, Anthony, this is my favorite story in the book. At 82 years old, a frail Thomas Jefferson opens the doors of the University of Virginia, and within months, students cover their faces in masks in kind of like an 1825 example of social media anonymity, and they start rioting through the campus that he personally designed and architected, chanting, "Down with European professors." And they take bags of urine and throw it at the professors. They beat another professor with the cane, and in sort of a twisted show of Southern honor, none of them will give each other up. So Jefferson, who's the rector of the university, calls an all-school assembly the next day for all the students to meet before the disciplinary committee. And the disciplinary committee for the University of Virginia in 1825 was Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe, the most intimidating disciplinary committee, past, present, and future. And so Jefferson stands up to address the students, and he starts bawling, hysterically crying. And so these students, they're so awestruck by this man that they revere, just being inconsolable. And at James Madison, all of 5'1", tells Jefferson to sit down, and he can't get a word out of his mouth before the students one by one confess. And this is the kind of man that Thomas Jefferson was. And each one of these presidents, I think part of why they found a greater sense of purpose after the White House is they figured out how to align who they were with what they did next. And the consistent thread, there's not a lot of consistent threads across all of them because they each did it in different ways. But the consistent thread is each one of them doubled down on something that they were dogmatically principled about.
Listen, it's fascinating. Jefferson, quite the life, got into a big political rub and row with John Adams. Of course, they became very famous pen pals and reconnected as friends years on in life. And then they famously died on the 50th anniversary of our birth on the 4th of July. I believe it was in 1826, although I can't remember who died first. Sort of feel like Adams outlived Jefferson, but I can't remember if that's the case. Go to Jimmy Carter for a second. Longest post-presidency, as you point out. You get into great detail in the book about things that he did, why he did those things. He is ignored, if I'm going to be brutally honest, by the right. They ignore him. He's loved by the left, and there's been some revisionist biographies of him recently. I've had the chance to go to the Carter Library, and I've toured it. He did a lot of really interesting and really good things for the country, including at a time of Cold War escalation, raising the defense budget. People don't give him credit for that, but he did do that. It set up Ronald Reagan quite nicely for the 80s. But how do you think Jimmy Carter feels about his presidency? He left the presidency as a young man. It's 42 years later. Did he do more as president, or did he do more as an ex-president?
So it's interesting. When I tell people, I wrote a book called Life After Power about ex-presidents, the first thing, whether it's Democrats or Republicans, the first thing people say is, oh, you must have included Carter. It's always the one that they, Carter will be known more as a former president than as a president. Some of that is a function of how long he lived, and that most people have experienced him more as a former president than as a president. But I also think that he's really the father of the modern ex-presidency. Herbert Hoover was the first one to become an elder statesman and the first one to, kind of enter the global stage as an ex-president. But Carter was the first one to do it turn the idea of being a former president and turn it into an actual institution. And the former president is an institution. And by the way, I think this is a tremendous part of Carter's legacy because the idea of former presidents is unique to democratic systems, at least as it pertains to them not being behind bars or under some other, ill fate. And former presidents are a feature, not a bug of our American democratic system, even when we don't always like what they do. And Carter really leaned into that and redefined it. And so if you look at his post-presidency, nobody can accuse the guy of being anything but transparent. From the moment he left office, he sort of described it as his involuntary retirement. He was $1 million in debt because he had put his peanut farm into a blind trust. He was devastated over having lost the election. He was devastated over the hostage crisis. He was devastated over, the economy. And he was a man guided by tremendous faith. This gets back to the point about principles. And, his view was, I am guided by God to do the things that I was put on this earth to do, and I'm going to do it for as long as I can, in whatever way I can, wherever I can, and I'll be damned if my successor has a problem with it. So in that sense, him and Bush are kind of opposites of each other, but he did some amazing things. I mean, if you look at this disease called guinea worm, he basically eradicated it from Africa. If you look at what he did in Panama, when George H.W. Bush sent him, when Noriega was trying to put his drug trafficker successor in place, he really elevated this idea of election monitoring and election transparency, which we still hold in high regard today. But he also caused all of his successors, Democrats and Republicans alike, a lot of annoyance. Right. So when George H.W. Bush is getting ready for Operation Desert Storm to get Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, Carter's anti-war mindset kicks in and he writes, secret letters to the heads of state of, several of the permanent members of the Security Council. Who does that as an ex-president? When Bill Clinton sends him to Pyongyang in 1994 as a messenger to Kim Il-sung, he tells Carter in no uncertain terms, you're a messenger, you're not president. You're not to make any policy, you're to deliver messages. And what does Carter do? He secretly negotiates a deal without any authority, goes on CNN and announces that deal. And that's how the Clinton administration finds out about it. And so, look, I think Carter is, he's an example of a president who was both a tremendous ally to his successors and a formidable adversary to his successors. So in a lot of respects, he's not just the father of the post-presidency, but he also kind of represents the best of the post-presidency and also kind of the worst of the post-presidency and everything in between.
Yeah, listen, it's a fascinating story about him. And obviously there's a messianic feel to Carter in some ways, where he's here on a mission and he's here, generally, I think he's viewed favorably, but the right has given Carter a hard time. Obviously, current presidential candidate, former President Trump, has juxtaposed him and Joe Biden, and he's somewhat used as a rag doll by the right. And obviously, but that's the unfairness of politics. And so I've experienced that, and I appreciate it and get it. Let's go to John Quincy Adams for a second, because he was groomed to be president. He had two founders. I would think his mother, Abigail, would see herself as a founding woman of the American Republic. And so he's groomed by these two founders. He goes on to become president himself. But as you say, he does better in the House of Representatives. He's also a former Secretary of State. What a fascinating character. So why does he do better in the House of Representatives as opposed to the presidency?
So I found writing about John Quincy Adams the most inspiring part of this book. And if I'm biased, I would say that my favorite ex-president is John Quincy Adams. So, again, he has this first act that's architected for him by his parents. It's not his choice. His parents are making, their son president of the United States. And he ends up as president because of a deal struck with Henry Clay when the 1824 election goes to the House of Representatives, and it gets sort of called the corrupt bargain. And there's this moment that I write about in the book where John Quincy Adams is swimming in the Potomac, and he gets overwhelmed by the current, and his clothes get weighed down, and he nearly drowns and dies, and he has to strip down naked. And him and his valet end up riding buck naked in a horse and buggy back to the White House, and he gets there, and it's just the symbolism is just like outrageous, right? Which is, he's naked and humiliated at the precise moment where his presidency has fallen apart, and he's still got 3 more years. And so he gets defeated for re-election in 1828, which is a foregone conclusion. And all this man knows how to do is what his parents set him up for, which is to serve the Republic. and it wasn't supposed to end this way. And he obsessively writes in his diary in the most self-loathing, self-deprecating, violin-playing manner. And finally, he's wandering around like a disenchanted ghost in Quincy, Massachusetts. And finally, they convince him. They say, look, you just got to go back into service. It's like the only thing that you know how to do. He's already been president. He's already been Secretary of State. He's been an ambassador multiple times. He's already served in the Senate. So the only thing left to do is go and serve in the House of Representatives. It's like the lowest position that he can possibly imagine, but he does it. And so he ends up as an ex-president, sort of a novelty in the House of Representatives, and he doesn't know what to do when he's there. And in 1830, if you were in the House of Representatives and you didn't know what to do, you just kind of read petitions. And it turned out that the petitions, some of them were from anti-slavery activists and abolitionists. And the abolitionist movement was a fringe movement there. Back then it was seen as very radical. And there was a norm that you didn't talk about slavery in Congress at the time. But Adams is reading these petitions, and he's shocked when the slaveocracy in the House lashes out at him for reading these petitions. And he's extremely principled about the right to petition. And the louder the critiques, the more voracious he is about accepting these petitions and reading them. The more he does that, obviously, the more demand there is. And he's just all of a sudden inundated with petitions from all over the country. And they decide to gag him, right? We talk about cancel culture today. In the 1830s, they tried to cancel a former president turned member of the House of Representatives. But his brain was so outsized relative to all the others in the House of Representatives that his 9 terms is just a story of him outmaneuvering and outfoxing and out-intellectualizing all of these mediocre men that he served with. And, he sort of wakes up one day as he's sort of, fighting on a daily basis to have all these petitions read. And he just wakes up one day and realizes that 2 things have happened. 1, he's become an abolitionist. 2, he's taken a movement that was fringy and radical and he's mainstreamed it. And to put this in perspective, John Quincy Adams began his career appointed by George Washington to serve in his administration. In his 9th term in the House of Representatives, he dies on the House floor serving alongside a freshman congressman named Abraham Lincoln from Illinois, this living connection between the founding generation and 2 generations later that would go on to emancipate the slaves.
Listen, I could listen to you for hours, Jared. You're a fascinating writer and a great public speaker. I've been dying to ask you this question, so I gotta see if I can frame it right. Were we right in terms of the formation of the presidency? And so I want to go back in our history. There was discussion about a potential king. Washington declined it. And we have this weird job, from a parliamentarian perspective, this executive branch is a misnomer from the way the parliamentary democracies got formed in Europe. Were we right to create a presidency? And what is the legacy of the presidency, all 46 of them?
So look, we take the evolution of Jeffersonian democracies for granted, and we often forget just how novel and revolutionary it was at the time. This idea of the peaceful transfer of power and elected by the people, albeit not all people back then. I think there's 2 things that are remarkable about the presidency. And I think about my 2 books, right? So Accidental Presidents and Life After Power. In some respects, it's a tale of 2 transitions. It's the transition, of somebody who wasn't really elected, transitioning to the presidency. And then Life After Power is the transition out of the presidency. Both of those need to be peaceful. And if I look at the founding fathers, they didn't really offer a blueprint for either. When it came to presidential succession upon a president dying in office, it was incredibly vague what happens. Lyndon Johnson in 1963 becomes president of the United States based on a precedent set by John Tyler in 1841 that's not even codified until 1967 with, the 25th Amendment, right? And so it shows you that just how revolutionary it was that the founders set in motion something that we could basically wing throughout the course of our history and muddle through and not get it perfectly, but more or less get it right. And if you think about former presidents, they didn't have a 2-term limit. that too gets codified in that same amendment in an earlier amendment, the 22nd Amendment after FDR's presidency. And so they left no provision for what to do with ex-presidents. Washington, sort of annotates it with the precedent of 2 terms. But as we've seen throughout history, many presidents have chanced that. Ulysses Grant tried to come back for a non-consecutive 3rd term. FDR was elected 4 times. And so, it wasn't a foregone conclusion that, you wouldn't have presidents stay forever. And so if I reflect back on the magic of our American democracy and what's so extraordinary about the idea of the American Revolution, they got so much right. I mean, they got a lot wrong also, but what they put in place in those early days before Washington becomes president, the fact that that was enough of a guide that could be iterated on over the course of history, and despite all the problems in the Republic that people, get up in arms about tonight, I think that at this moment in time, I think you have to reflect back on the last 200 plus years, and we've done pretty good, given how many bumps in the road there were.
System's fragile. I think that's the other thing. The system was made by men mostly. We could say men and women, but it was made mostly by men. It was a fragile system, and it took noble ideas, and it took noble decision making, and it took a great deal of humility to bow out appropriately, to allow for this succession, which has created this flat structure, has allowed the Cohen family and the Scaramucci family to flourish in a country like this, because you don't have that aristocracy and you don't have that royalty, the monarchical stuff that holds back some of these other countries. I want to flip over. I know we're running out of time, but if I can just get you a few more moments, I want to flip over to Accidental Presidents, 8 Men Who Changed America, which was another incredible book. And I want to talk about Harry Truman for a second. What an unexpected presidency, right? He's a failed haberdasher. He's part of this Pendergast political machine in Missouri. He gets to the Senate. He doesn't see himself anywhere close to the presidency. He wants to nominate Burns to be the vice president in 44. He walks into the meeting. He hears FDR's voice, and wait a minute, they want me. And so he reluctantly accepts it. And then, of course, he's told by Eleanor Roosevelt, he says, "How can I help you?" upon the death of her husband. And, of course, Eleanor says, real question is, how can we help you? And so there he is. He's got to make some fateful decisions. Tell us a little bit about him.
So Harry Truman is basically a provincial politician from Missouri who really only ends up thrown on the ticket in 1944 because the Democratic Party bosses know that FDR is a dying man, but nobody dares admit it. And FDR also knew that he was on borrowed time, and he didn't want to give the party bosses any sense that they owned his presidency. So he played lots of manipulative games to kind of drag it out. And, Truman, again, at the 11th hour, ends up on the ticket because the Democratic Party bosses just cannot fathom the idea of Henry Wallace becoming president of the United States if FDR dies, because they either thought he was too liberal even for them, or they thought he was a communist sympathizer. And I think it's remarkable because despite how sick FDR was, there seems to have been very little contemplation about the idea of a Harry Truman presidency. So in Truman's 82 days in office as vice president, he only meets FDR 2 times. He never steps foot in the map room where World War II is being planned. He doesn't get a single intelligence briefing. He doesn't meet a single world leader. He's not briefed on the atomic bomb and the Manhattan Project. He's basically out kind of socializing as vice president, which is kind of what you do. And when FDR dies on April 12th, 1945, I don't believe that there is a man in history that has inherited a greater inflection point than Harry Truman at that particular moment in time. You had the Battle of Okinawa raging, one of the fiercest battles. You had the prospect of having to move 1 million men from the European theater to the Asian Pacific theater. You had Stalin reneging on all of his promises from Yalta. You had a turf battle between the Army and Navy. You had Churchill playing all kinds of games. The list goes on. And Harry Truman has to spend his first couple days as president just learning where these countries are on a map in the map room. And, I always say about Truman that he was set up for just utter failure. And the fact that he managed to end the war in 9 months, make some of the toughest decisions, reshape the post-World War II era, and reshape the international system. I don't know that it's statistically improbable as much as it shows you that leaders aren't leaders until the context gives them the opportunity to step up. And by the way, we've seen this today with, President Zelensky, very different as a wartime president. And so until they're tested, leaders aren't, you can't really know that leaders are made. Sometimes leaders, in the context of a campaign, somebody who seems like a great leader, they fumble it when there's a real test. And, Harry Truman is an example of a leader made by and for a crisis.
I find your writing fascinating because you're bringing things that we learned about in social studies in a very two-dimensional way about these figures, and you're adding color, you're adding technicolor, and you're adding a perspective of their personalities and their humanness. Sometimes we look at our founders and we put them in effigy, but at the end of the day, with all the frailty and all of the shortcomings of a human being, they carried all of that with them as well. And I just find it fascinating that you capture that so well. We're at the point in the podcast where me and my producers, we come up with 5 words for the author. So that you got to react to the words, okay? So I'll say them and you give me a reaction. So the first word I'm thinking of, Jared, is power.
Dangerous, yet burden of responsibility.
It's interesting you say dangerous because the founders would have said dangerous. The Federalist Papers said we're just not equipped for it, which is why the separation of powers, those clauses in the contract known as the Constitution, are the most important. Justice Scalia once said to me at lunch with him, I said, what's the most important part of the Constitution? He said, separation of powers. Without that, we don't have this liberty. Service. What about the word service, sir?
The most important thing that one can do when put on this earth, whether they do it early in life or later in life.
Oh, well said. I think Jackie Robinson once said that we're at our best when we're serving others. Chaos.
A reality. Something that can't just be managed. Something that requires solution.
I'm going to say America. Some people say Murica, and you know what I mean when I say Murica? The word America.
Don't give up on her.
Yeah, amen. It's a beautiful place. It's been an incredible global experiment. The word president, Jared.
Steward of the Republic.
Yeah, and as you pointed out in your book, it's the only job where every American citizen that's eligible to vote votes for that job. The other jobs in the Republic are limited to your location, if it's a congressional district, or your state. But this federal job is one that we all get the chance to vote for. And so it's a very powerful position and one that requires a lot of responsibility. What's next for you?
It's interesting. I used to be one of these. So when you spend, 3 or 4 years writing a book, you sort of, 2 things happen. One, you get obsessed with the topic. 2, you find ways to relate what you're writing to like literally anything anyone says. So somebody tells me the sky is blue, I say we should talk about John Quincy Adams or William Howard Taft. But it's been a really interesting, reflective journey for me to be 42 years old. I started this book in my 30s, writing about retirement. It morphed. I thought I was writing about the last chapter of life. What I realized is I was writing about a recurring question we're going to ask many times in life, which is, what do we do next? And I used to be one of these people who, I would say that I kind of, lived to work, meaning I'd get up every single day and I would think about work, think about what I was going to do next for work. And I wasn't living in the present. And I think this book helped me get to a mental state. And I also transitioned jobs from Google to Goldman Sachs while writing this book, where I finally find myself in a situation where I think I'm somebody who works to live. And what I mean by that is when people ask me what's next, my answer is, on this particular day, I engaged with the smartest people, worked on the most interesting ideas, got to feel like I was having an impact. And what's next is I want to wake up tomorrow and do it all over again. And I don't want to think about what's next.
Well, listen, I think it's brilliant. And by the way, you do work at a very special place. I spent 7 years of my life there. Of course, it was 27 years ago, so it's a little different place than the one that I left in 1996. But it is unique and top of the field for anybody. And I always remind my friends and colleagues that are there or have left there how lucky we all are to have had that shared experience at Goldman. But you got a lot of things coming, and so I want to be one of those guys that watches and cheers you on. I'm looking forward to your next books, but the title of this book is Life After Power: 7 Presidents and Their Search for Purpose Beyond the White House. A best-selling New York Times best-selling author, Jared Cohen. With great respect, sir, thank you for joining us on Open Book. We love your work.
Anthony, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.